That morning, the space beside me stayed untouched. No laptop, no coffee cup, no casual apology. Just a clean gap. Like someone had quietly erased my name before the meeting even started. Ross Keegan didn't look at the agenda. He looked at me. He smiled, not the friendly kind. The kind you use when you've already decided the outcome and want to enjoy the delivery. "Let's skip the pleasantries," he said. "Your role has become a liability." The word hung there. Liability. Not outdated. Not misaligned. A risk. A few heads dipped. Someone coughed. No one objected. Ross continued, calm and almost amused. "We don't need personalities holding relationships together anymore. We need systems, scalable ones." And frankly, he shrugged. "You cost more than you're worth." That was the moment the shock hit. Not loud, not dramatic, just sharp enough to take my breath away. There was no follow-up explanation, no chart, no performance review, just a decision dressed up as efficiency. Ross had already moved on, as if I were a line item he'd deleted 10 minutes earlier. I understood what he was doing. Ross believed power came from titles and spreadsheets. That control meant stripping emotion out of decisions. People like me made him uncomfortable because trust couldn't be quantified, and history couldn't be automated. What follows is a dramatized story inspired by real workplace dynamics, developed with AI to highlight deeper lessons and emotional truths. If this isn't the kind of story you enjoy, it's okay to pause here, take a break, get some rest, and look after yourself. For 12 years, I had been the constant, the one partners called before signing, the one who made risk feel manageable simply by being in the room. I didn't close deals, I made them possible. Ross saw none of that. Or worse, he saw it and didn't care. The pressure built slowly, hot and humiliating. Being fired was one thing. Being dismissed like obsolete software was another. I didn't argue. I didn't list accomplishments. I said the only sentence that still belonged to me. "Understood. I won't be representing the company anymore." Ross smiled wider. To him, it sounded like surrender. As I stood, I caught the chairman watching me. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend me. But his eyes stayed on me longer than necessary. Not indifferent. Uneasy, like someone who had just realized the room was quieter than it should have been. If this scene stirred something in you, you're not alone. Check in with yourself for a moment. Maybe straighten up a corner of your desk or room. Something small that gives you a sense of order. Let me know where you're listening from. And if you want to see how quiet moments turn into real consequences, subscribe and stay. This story hasn't even started unfolding yet. I packed my desk without asking for boxes. There was no ceremony to it. No final tour of the floor. Just a quiet, methodical clearing. As if I were correcting an administrative error, rather than erasing 12 years of presence. Human resources stood nearby, pretending to review a tablet while watching every movement. They didn't rush me. They didn't comfort me either. Oversight disguised as courtesy around us. Colleagues avoided eye contact with impressive discipline. People who had called me daily last week suddenly found the carpet fascinating. Silence, I realized, was the company's preferred severance package. I moved slowly, not because I needed time, but because speed would have suggested panic. Each item I placed into my bag felt heavier than it should have. A notebook from a Zurich meeting, a pen from a Tokyo signing, small artifacts from rooms where decisions had been made because I was trusted to be there. Trust had been my actual job, not sales, not numbers. Over a decade, I had built relationships with funds, banks, and international partners who cared less about presentations and more about consistency. They didn't ask for guarantees. They asked if I would be involved. That was usually enough. I remembered the calls that came after hours, the quiet confirmations, the moments when my presence steadied negotiations that could have collapsed from doubt alone. Those things never appeared on performance dashboards. They lived in memory, in tone, in follow-through. Ross had never been interested in any of that. From across the floor, my phone buzzed, then stopped. I glanced down. Email access revoked. Calendar syncing failed. One by one. Meetings disappeared, as if they had never existed. My name was being unthreaded from the system in real time. A company-wide email followed minutes later. Ross's name sat neatly at the top. Subject line, streamlining leadership. The language was polished, optimistic, almost cheerful. A strategic evolution, a necessary shift. No mention of me, except in the way absence can be loud when it's intentional. By mid-afternoon, it was complete. No inbox, no calendar, no credentials. I walked past the security desk and handed over my badge without being asked. The guard nodded, already trained to forget faces. Outside, the air felt unchanged, which was almost insulting. Traffic moved. Phones rang. The world hadn't noticed I'd been deleted. I sat in my car for a moment, letting the frustration crest and settle. Being fired hurt. Being erased was something else entirely. It was designed to make you question whether you'd ever mattered at all. My phone vibrated again. This time, it wasn't the company. A message from the largest investment partner I'd worked with for years. No subject line, just a sentence. It arrived quietly, without urgency, and that made it heavier. Can we talk off the record? Tonight, just us. We met in a quiet restaurant halfway between their office and my apartment, the kind of place chosen to avoid recognition. I arrived early, not from nerves, but habit, for years. I had been the one who showed up first, prepared. Steady, predictable, titles change. Trust prefers consistency. This time, I came without a company name attached to me, no badge, no calendar invite, no talking points cleared by legal, just me. The partner from the investment fund arrived a few minutes later and shook my hand like nothing had changed. That alone told me the meeting mattered. We ordered coffee, no one rushed. Silence did part of the work for us. After a moment, he asked the question directly. Who do we trust now? It wasn't emotional. It wasn't accusatory. It was operational. A system checking whether its stabilizing component was still in place. I didn't criticize Ross. I didn't defend myself. I didn't describe the boardroom or the smile that ended my job. None of that was useful. I answered with the only fact that mattered. That decision isn't mine anymore. He nodded once, slowly. No follow-up, no reassurance, just acknowledgement. People misunderstand power because they expect it to announce itself. It doesn't. It listens. It records. It decides later. I could feel that process begin, not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing did. We spoke about neutral ground after that. Market volatility, timing, how leadership teams confuse speed with control. I chose my words carefully. The way you do when you're no longer representing an institution, only your own judgment. No promises were exchanged. That absence was deliberate. When the meeting ended, he paid the bill without comment and stood. We'll be in touch, he said evenly. I watched him leave and felt something settle into place. Influence hadn't disappeared with my job. It had simply detached itself from the logo. The fund didn't call the company. They didn't demand explanations or issue warnings. They activated internal processes designed for moments like this: risk assessment, exposure review, trust evaluation. Those processes don't create noise. They create delays inside the company. Everything probably looked normal that afternoon. Calendars full, meetings scheduled, slides polished. Ross would have assumed momentum was intact. Elsewhere, quietly and professionally, the system was recalibrating, not out of loyalty, not out of revenge, because trust, once removed, doesn't reinstall itself under new management. I drove home calmly, aware that nothing visible had changed yet. That was the point. If you're still here, you're probably as curious as I was back then. The first crack didn't announce itself loudly. It arrived dressed as confidence. Ross took over every partner meeting the moment I was gone. He didn't ask questions. He delivered statements. He spoke in percentages and timelines, leaning into the tone of someone who believed momentum alone could substitute for reassurance. From what I later heard, he smiled often. Too often. Confidence, when overused, starts to feel like pressure. At first, nothing broke. Then the bank asked for additional guarantees. It wasn't dramatic. No threats, no raised voices, just a polite request delivered through proper channels. Ross waved it off in the executive meeting, calling it standard noise. He told everyone not to overreact. Still, the request lingered, unanswered, sitting like a loose thread no one wanted to pull. A day later, the investment fund requested a temporary pause on disbursements, not a cancellation, a delay, the kind of word executives pretend not to hear. Ross reacted badly this time. He snapped at legal, accusing them of creating uncertainty. He demanded faster responses, clearer language, tighter control. Control, to him, was always the solution. Watching this from the outside gave me perspective. I wasn't angry anymore. I was curious. How many leaders mistake authority for trust? How often do they believe replacing a person replaces the confidence that person carried? I'll ask you this because it matters. When leadership changes abruptly, should trust automatically follow the title, or does it stay with the people who earned it over time? Think about that as this unfolds. Inside the company, the legal team began to feel the ground shift. The head of legal stopped speaking in absolutes and started asking questions. That change alone signaled trouble. Lawyers sense risk before numbers do. They feel it in tone, in phrasing, in what isn't being said. Ross responded by pushing harder. More meetings, more emails, more certainty. Delivered louder each time. He believed resistance meant misunderstanding. He never considered that hesitation might mean assessment. Then the CFO delivered the update. The money hadn't disappeared. No accounts were closed, no contracts voided, but nothing was moving. Funds were held, transfers delayed, commitments marked as pending, frozen not lost. That distinction mattered more than anyone realized. A pause can be reversed. A freeze requires justification, and justification demands trust. As I listened to this unfold, one thought stayed with me: real power rarely announces itself. It waits, it watches, and when it hesitates, it's already decided that something fundamental has changed. From that moment on, the room stopped being stable. Every decision leaned heavier, every delay louder. The system wasn't panicking yet, it was measuring, and measurement, I had learned, was the beginning of consequence. Quietly, precisely. Without warning, Ross didn't slow down when pressure started to surface. He accelerated inside the boardroom. He reassured the directors with the same calm certainty he had used to end my role. "She's irrelevant now," he said, dismissing concerns with a practiced wave of his hand. "We've already moved on." No one challenged him. Silence passed for agreement. Even though it wasn't, he launched a full roadshow within days. Slide decks were immaculate. Talking points repeated the same promise: institutional stability, leadership continuity, process over personality. Ross delivered those words like guarantees, confident that volume and repetition could substitute for trust. He spoke at conferences, joined investor calls, and shook hands with people who smiled politely while committing to nothing. That absence of commitment was the warning he ignored. Meetings ended warmly, but without signatures or timelines. No one followed up. Ross treated it as temporary resistance. Something pressure could correct. Persistence, he believed, had always worked before. From the outside, the pattern looked familiar. The more aggressively he sold stability, the more uncertain the room became. Trust doesn't respond well to force. It withdraws. Then my phone rang. I recognized the number immediately. Ross didn't bother with greetings. "If you're talking to anyone," he said, his voice tight with restraint, "I expect professionalism." The message was clear. Stay quiet. Don't complicate things. Accept removal without friction. "I am." I replied. 2 words. No explanation, no defense. The call ended. I sat with that moment longer than I expected. Leaders often confuse professionalism with obedience. To Ross, professionalism meant protecting the narrative. To me, It meant accuracy without theatrics. I hadn't contacted anyone, I hadn't offered commentary, but I hadn't misled anyone either. What Ross didn't understand was that systems record behavior as carefully as they record numbers. That call became part of a broader assessment at the investment fund, not because it crossed legal lines, but because it revealed pressure where transparency should have been. Tone matters when trust is being evaluated. Inside the company, unease spread quietly. The board asked fewer questions, but listened harder. The CFO began flagging inconsistencies. Legal stopped offering certainty and started documenting risk. Ross reacted by tightening control, convinced authority could still bend outcomes back into place. That call was logged as a data point, small, but cumulative. Evidence that leadership was managing perception instead of exposure. The fund didn't react publicly. They didn't warn the company. They recalibrated. I realized then that resistance doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like careful notation. Ross was pushing back, fighting to reclaim control, unaware that every move was being measured against a standard he no longer defined. And once that standard shifts, momentum reverses quietly, carrying consequences forward until there's nowhere left to stand. Before I go on, how do you think this will end when governance mode activates? It doesn't announce itself with panic or accusations. It arrives quietly, wrapped in procedure, carried by emails written to sound routine. That was when I knew the situation had crossed a line Ross could no longer talk his way across. The fund and the bank didn't threaten lawsuits. They didn't accuse anyone of wrongdoing. They simply initiated their risk governance protocols, the kind designed for moments when confidence needs verification. These processes exist precisely to avoid drama. They replace emotion with checklists, authority with structure, requests followed, delivered without commentary. The first was simple, a change in designated representative, not a dismissal, not a punishment, just a requirement that someone else speak on the company's behalf. The second arrived shortly after additional guarantee conditions, revised exposure limits, and extended review periods, all legal, all justified, all non-negotiable. Inside the company, Ross reacted as if this were temporary friction. He argued that continuity mattered, that leadership stability reassured markets. But governance systems don't respond to persuasion. They respond to alignment, and alignment was no longer present. I watched this unfold with a kind of detached clarity. No anger, no satisfaction, just recognition. This was what accountability looked like when stripped of theatrics. No raised voices, no ultimatums, just consequences unfolding at their own pace. Meetings began to shift. Invitations arrived without Ross's name attached. Calls that once required his presence proceeded without it. Decisions moved forward through legal and finance channels, bypassing the office he still occupied. Power didn't confront him. It routed around him. The board sensed it before they admitted it. Fewer questions were directed at Ross. More were sent directly to compliance and finance. Control had become conditional. Then the message arrived. It was addressed to the board. Brief and unmistakably formal. No explanations, no justification. One sentence did all the work. We prefer not to engage with Ross Keegan directly. I didn't celebrate this shift, and I didn't warn anyone it was coming. Governance doesn't need witnesses. It operates whether you approve or not. And it rarely explains itself. In those days, I understood something clearly. Leadership isn't tested when authority is granted, but when it's quietly withdrawn. Everything after that becomes procedural, irreversible, and painfully calm. The restraint felt colder than conflict, because nothing remained to argue against once the process moved forward on its own terms. No voices rose, and no doors slammed shut. Just silence doing its work. Without witnesses. That was the moment governance finished what confidence had started. Ross hadn't been removed. He hadn't been disgraced. But he was no longer trusted to represent anything that mattered. And in systems like these, representation is the only power that lasts. The board meeting wasn't announced on any calendar. It appeared quietly, labeled confidential, attendance mandatory. That alone signaled trouble. Boards don't hide meetings unless they're afraid of what might surface once the doors close. I wasn't in the room, but I knew how it unfolded. The chairman opened without ceremony, hands folded, voice steady enough to disguise the strain. When did we lose their trust? No one answered. Silence stretched longer than comfort allowed. Directors shifted, papers shuffled, eyes avoided one another. Trust doesn't disappear overnight, yet no one could point to a single moment it left. That was the problem. It hadn't vanished loudly, it had drained away, decision by decision, unnoticed until it mattered. Ross broke the pause with certainty that felt rehearsed. "They'll come around," he said. "This is temporary resistance. I've seen that instinct before. Leaders convincing themselves that confidence is contagious, that if they project enough certainty, reality will eventually align, in my experience. That belief marks the line between leadership and denial. Here's something I want you to consider, because it matters beyond this story. When trust erodes, is it ever loud, or does it usually slip away quietly? While everyone insists nothing has changed, I'm curious how you've seen it happen. Inside that room, panic didn't look like shouting, it looked like restraint. The legal team stopped offering timelines. Finance stopped forecasting growth and started revising exposure. Every question became conditional, every answer provisional. Reports followed, one deal postponed, then another. Language softened at first, then hardened into phrases no executive wants to hear: indefinite hold, pending review, subject to reassessment. Each delay carried weight, and together they began to bend the structure of the company. Ross doubled down. He insisted momentum would return. He dismissed concerns as optics, blamed caution for creating hesitation. To him, hesitation was a choice. He refused to see it as a verdict from the outside. The pattern was clear. Institutions don't panic the way people do. They retreat, they preserve, they wait. And waiting, in markets like these, is rarely neutral. By the end of the week, the numbers were undeniable. The CFO presented preliminary figures, carefully phrased, but devastating all the same. Deferred commitments now exceeded $1 billion. With projections climbing by the hour, no one argued. If you've ever watched a room, realize it misjudged power. You know the feeling. It's not explosive, it's hollow. The certainty drains out, leaving behind calculation and fear. That meeting ended without resolution. Because resolution requires trust. And trust, once gone, doesn't return on demand. It has to be earned again, slowly, painfully, or not at all. Silence lingered, confirming how far control had slipped. Ross Keegan wasn't fired. That was the part people found confusing. In most stories, failure demands spectacle, a resignation, a headline, an escorted exit. This one offered none of that. Ross kept his title, his office, his reserved parking space. On paper, nothing had changed. In practice, everything had. It began with small omissions. Documents circulated without his signature line. Meeting summaries listed executive review but never named him. Invitations to partner calls arrived stripped of his presence, routed instead through legal or finance. No announcement explained the shift. No justification was offered. The system simply adjusted, Ross noticed. Of course, anyone would. He asked questions that received polite answers, without substance. He asserted authority that no longer moved outcomes. Decisions progressed. Just not through him. Power didn't confront him. It bypassed him. I watched from a distance. Not with satisfaction, but with clarity. This was exile without removal. A role emptied of function, preserved only to avoid disruption. Ross had become symbolic leadership visible, contained and irrelevant. He could no longer sign. His approval carried no weight. He wasn't allowed to represent the company to banks or partners, not because of misconduct, but because confidence required a different interface. Institutions don't punish leaders. They reroute risk. That distinction mattered. Ross wasn't disgraced. He was sidelined, and in environments governed by trust. Sidelining is permanent. One afternoon, The head of legal called me, not officially, not recorded, just a quiet acknowledgement. You were the control layer, she said. She didn't say it with regret or apology, just recognition, control, in her world, meant preventing exposure before it became visible. Ross had mistaken authority for control. The system had corrected that assumption without explanation. Inside the company, people adjusted quickly, they always do. Reports flowed around Ross. Strategy discussions happened elsewhere. His presence became ceremonial. Tolerated but unnecessary. He still spoke. But no one waited for his conclusion. Influence had migrated. Then the board formalized what had already occurred. A brief notice circulated, carefully worded, temporary adjustment of the CEO's role to support operational continuity. No timelines, no criteria, no end date. The language was neutral enough to sound reversible, which made it final. Ross hadn't lost his job. He'd lost his function. That was the cold satisfaction of it. No revenge, no confrontation. Just systems doing what systems do when trust is withdrawn. They preserve stability by removing volatility, not by destroying it. I understood then that exile is more effective than expulsion. Expulsion creates noise. Exile creates silence, and silence, once established, becomes the new operating environment. Ross remained in the building, but the company had already moved on without him. The final report arrived without drama. No urgent calls, no emergency meetings, no raised voices demanding explanations. It was uploaded quietly to the board portal, time-stamped, formatted, complete. I read it alone. Not because I had to, but because I needed to see the number myself. $2.3 billion. Not lost, not stolen, simply gone. The report didn't use emotional language. It never does. It listed outcomes with clinical precision: withdrawn, postponed, re-evaluated. Each word carried weight, not because it accused anyone, but because it confirmed what trust had already decided. Deals didn't collapse. They dissolved. Slowly enough to avoid headlines, completely enough to be irreversible. There was no scandal to point at, no rogue executive, no leaked email to analyze on television. The market hadn't punished the company. It had simply stepped back. Distance, in finance, is judgment without spectacle. Ross was still CEO when the report circulated, still employed, still officially in charge. Yet when I heard where he was reading it, the picture felt complete. He sat alone in the executive conference room, the same room where my role had ended with a smile, the same long table, now empty. No legal counsel, no finance team, no board members seated nearby, just Ross, the report, and the quiet realization that authority means nothing without representation. I didn't feel triumphant reading that. Justice rarely feels loud. It felt balanced, measured, proportionate. The system had responded exactly as designed, without bias or cruelty. It removed exposure, it corrected risk, it protected itself. That was the moment I understood something clearly. Power doesn't need to humiliate. It doesn't need revenge. It only needs clarity. And clarity had arrived in the form of absence. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. It was the chairman. He didn't speak in metaphors. He didn't apologize. He acknowledged reality. "We're exploring a new initiative," he said. Outside the company, there was no pitch attached, no pressure, just an invitation to discuss something that still required trust. I agreed to meet. When the call ended, I sat quietly, letting the moment settle. I hadn't asked for restitution. I hadn't demanded recognition. I had simply stepped away when representation ended and allowed the system to recalibrate on its own terms. $2.3 billion wasn't punishment. It was consequence. No one had raised a hand against Ross. No one had needed to. The structure had spoken for itself. Calmly and conclusively, justice didn't announce its arrival. It documented it, and in that documentation, everything finally made sense. I didn't go back. That choice surprised some people, but it felt obvious to me the moment the call ended. Returning would have meant restoring a title, not the trust that had shifted elsewhere. Instead, I chose representation over position. I met in a neutral office, signed an agreement, and accepted a role defined by responsibility rather than hierarchy. No press release followed, no announcement was necessary. The work spoke for itself, and that was enough. The process was calm, transparent, respectful. Every clause was clear, every expectation mutual. For the first time in years, my name was attached to something without politics hovering nearby. It felt lighter than success ever had inside that building. I thought about Ross Keegan, still listed as CEO, still occupying the same office, still introduced with the same title. On paper, nothing had been taken from him. In reality, everything that mattered had moved on. That contrast stayed with me. Authority can survive without trust, but it can't function. Representation, once withdrawn, doesn't return by demand or decree. I closed the folder, stood up, and left without looking back. The ending wasn't dramatic. It was precise. Turns out, I wasn't fired. I was released. What stayed with me after everything settled wasn't the number, or the meetings, or even the silence that followed. It was the realization that power behaves very differently when it's real. Real power doesn't shout. It doesn't rush to defend itself. It waits, observes, and moves only when the structure demands it. Living through that taught me something no leadership seminar ever could trust is not an accessory to authority. It is the authority. There were moments when being erased hurt more than being fired, being cut from calendars, conversations. And memory is a uniquely modern kind of loss. And yet, that absence created space. Space to see clearly who I was without a title attached. Space to notice that the value I carried had never belonged to the company in the first place. It belonged to the relationships I built, the consistency I showed, the quiet responsibility I took when no one was watching. What surprised me most was how humane the outcome felt. No revenge, no spectacle, just alignment. The system didn't collapse, it corrected. And in that correction, I found something steadier than victory dignity, the kind that doesn't need witnesses. If you're listening and this resonates, I'd really like to hear your thoughts. What do you think matters more in leadership position or trust? Have you ever seen authority survive after credibility was gone? Share your perspective in the comments. If this story gave you something to reflect on, consider liking or sharing it with someone who might need it. And if you want to stay with stories about quiet justice, real consequences, and human dignity at work, subscribe. Sometimes the most powerful endings don't close doors, they open the right ones.